A stranger woman called me and said, "I'm pregnant by your husband. We've been together for 4 years." My husband was sitting right across from me. I put it on speaker. He gripped the table. What happened next? Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me when I knew. They expect me to say it was the lipstick on the collar, or the late nights, or the smell of someone else's perfume. But the truth is messier than that. The truth is that I knew something was wrong long before I was willing to admit what that something was. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 38 years old, and for 11 years I was married to Daniel Whitmore, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order, held doors open for strangers, and volunteered at a food bank every Thanksgiving. That was the man I fell in love with in a coffee shop in Austin, Texas, when I was 26, and foolish enough to think that a man's charm was the same thing as his character. We had a good life, a real one, not an Instagram version. Our house in the suburbs of Nashville had a leaky gutter we never got around to fixing. I burned dinner at least twice a week. Daniel left his socks on the bathroom floor every single morning for 11 years, and somehow that small domestic failure had become something I loved about him. We laughed. We fought about money and then made up. We built something together, or so I believed. I was a licensed occupational therapist with a private practice I'd spent 6 years growing from nothing. Daniel ran the regional sales division for a medical equipment company. We had no children, a choice we'd made together after long, honest conversations, and our life was full in the way that childless lives can be. Travel, friends, a dog named Biscuit who slept at the foot of our bed. I want you to understand that life, the texture of it, because what came next didn't happen to a woman who was sleepwalking. It happened to me, to someone who was paying attention, just not to the right things. The first signal came 8 months before the phone call. Daniel started going to the gym in the evenings instead of the mornings. A small thing. I noticed it, filed it under midlife fitness shift, and moved on. Then came the new cologne, subtle, expensive. Nothing like the cedar scent he'd worn for years. I told myself he deserved to treat himself. I was a therapist. I knew the danger of over-interpreting behavior. I applied that knowledge to everyone except the person I should have been watching most carefully. By month 5, there were weekend work trips that used to happen twice a year and now happened almost monthly. By month 6, he started sleeping with his phone face down on the nightstand. I remember standing in our kitchen one Sunday morning, watching him scroll through something with a posture I'd never seen on him before. Hunched, private, a slight tension in his jaw, and thinking, what is he reading that he doesn't want me to see? I made his coffee. I handed it to him. He looked up and smiled, and the smile was so perfectly natural that I believed it. That was Daniel's real gift, not charm, but seamlessness. He never got flustered. He never over-explained. He was the most convincing person I had ever met, and I had mistaken that for honesty. The call came on a Thursday evening in March. I remember the exact light in the kitchen, that pale gold that comes just before Nashville sunsets, and Daniel sitting across from me at the table, laptop open, pretending to review quarterly reports. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. I didn't. Is this Claire Whitmore? The voice was young, steady, and careful. Not aggressive, not hysterical. Controlled in the way a person is controlled when they've rehearsed something 100 times. "Yes," I said. "My name is Megan. I think we need to talk. I'm pregnant, and the father is your husband." The kitchen went very quiet, or maybe the noise just moved somewhere inside me, folding itself into a low hum behind my ears. I looked across the table at Daniel. He was still looking at his laptop screen. He hadn't heard. Not yet. And then I did something I still can't fully explain. Instinct or fury or some cold mechanical part of my brain that clicked into gear before the grief could arrive. I put the call on speaker. I set the phone on the table between us, screen down, without a word. "We've been together for 4 years, Megan continued. "He told me you two were separated. He told me you'd been done for years. I found out last month that wasn't true. I'm due in July, and I think you deserve to know." I watched Daniel's face as every word landed. I watched his hands, which had been resting loosely on the edge of the laptop, slowly tighten, his knuckles pressed into the wood, not fleeing, not moving, just gripping, as if the table were the only solid thing left in the room. "Daniel," I said. My voice surprised me, calm, almost clinical. "Is there something you'd like to say?" He said nothing. His jaw was tight. His eyes finally moved from the screen to me, and in them I saw something I'd never seen in 11 years of marriage. Not guilt exactly, not even fear. Something more primitive than that. The look of a man who has been running a very long race and has just realized the finish line was never where he thought it was. Outside, a car passed. Biscuit padded into the kitchen and lay down beside the refrigerator. The Nashville evening continued on, indifferent. That was the moment everything I had built began to crack. But here's what I want you to understand. The crack was not the end. It was the beginning. Because I am not the kind of woman who stands still while her life falls apart around her. I just didn't know that yet. I hung up the phone. I didn't say anything dramatic. I didn't throw it across the room. I just ended the call, picked up my mug, and carried it to the sink. I stood there with my back to Daniel for what felt like a long time, looking out the window at the yard where Biscuit's tennis ball sat forgotten in the grass. "Claire." His voice was low. "Careful." "Don't," I said. And he didn't. That night I slept in the guest room, not because I was being theatrical about it. I genuinely could not be in the same bed as him. My body refused. I lay on top of the covers in the dark and did what I'd been trained to do with patience in crisis. I inventoried. I took stock. I tried to look at the situation the way a stranger would without flinching. 4 years. The affair had been going on for 4 years. That meant it had started when Daniel and I were celebrating our 7th anniversary in Savannah. That meant it had been alive during his father's funeral, during my mother's hip surgery, during every holiday, every weekend trip, every quiet Tuesday night on the couch, watching television. It had been running parallel to our entire life like a second track, and I had been riding the wrong train without knowing it. The grief hit me around 2 in the morning. Real grief. The kind that doesn't announce itself with tears right away, but arrives as a physical weight in the chest, a hollowness behind the sternum. I had loved this man. I had built my adult life around the assumption of his faithfulness, the way you build a house around a foundation you never bother to inspect because it's never given you reason to doubt it. And then I thought about Megan. She was pregnant. She had believed she was in a relationship with a man who was separated from his wife. She had been lied to also. In different ways, for different reasons, we had both been deceived by the same person. And that complicated my anger in ways I hadn't expected. I didn't want to feel sympathy for her. It was easier to despise her. But I'm a therapist. I know what triangulation looks like. I knew that Daniel had created this situation, not her. By morning, the grief had done something I've seen happen in my own patients after acute crisis. It had condensed, compressed itself into something smaller and denser and far more useful. By the time the sun came through the curtains, I wasn't devastated anymore. I was focused. Daniel knocked on the door at 7. I told him to give me the day. He did. I sat at the desk in the guest room with a legal pad, and I did what I always do when I'm overwhelmed. I made a list, not of feelings, of facts. 11 years of marriage, a jointly owned home, valued at roughly $480,000, 2 cars, both in both names, a joint savings account, my private practice, entirely in my name, thank God, his pension, his stock options, his 401k, and 4 years of deception that, in the state of Tennessee, would absolutely matter in a divorce proceeding, because that was already the word forming in my mind. Divorce. Not as a threat, not as an emotional reaction, as a legal reality I needed to prepare for, carefully, before Daniel had the chance to prepare for it himself. I knew enough from clients who'd been through divorce to understand that the spouse who acts first, calmly, strategically, with documentation, almost always fares better. I also knew that acting from rage was the fastest way to make expensive mistakes, so I chose not to act from rage. I called my best friend, Karen Osley, from the bathroom with the water running and told her in a whisper what had happened. She was silent for a full 10 seconds. Then she said, "What do you need?" Not "I can't believe it" or "What are you going to do?" Just, "What do you need?" That's why she's been my best friend for 22 years. "I need a family law attorney," I said, "the best one in Nashville, and I need you not to tell anyone yet." Karen called me back within 2 hours with a name, Patricia Helms, a divorce attorney known for handling high-asset cases with what people described as surgical precision. I called Patricia's office that same afternoon and made an appointment for the following Monday, telling them only that I was seeking a consultation regarding a complex marital situation. I also opened a new email account, not connected to any device Daniel had access to, and began quietly documenting. I went back through credit card statements I could access online and started screenshotting charges I didn't recognize. 2 hotels in Atlanta, a jewelry store I'd never heard of, a restaurant in Brentwood on a night Daniel had told me he was in Memphis for work. I wasn't performing, I wasn't spiraling, I was building a case. That evening, Daniel cooked dinner. Pasta, something simple, a gesture of contrition or normalcy. I wasn't sure which. I sat across from him and ate it. I answered his careful, tentative questions in short sentences. He told me he wanted to explain. I told him I wasn't ready. He accepted that with the composure of a man who believed he still had the advantage. He didn't yet know that I was already several moves ahead of him, and I intended to keep it that way. Monday morning, I sat in the clean, quiet offices of Helms & Associates on West End Avenue and told Patricia Helms everything. I brought the screenshots. I brought the credit card statements. I brought the notes I'd made on my legal pad. I was precise. I didn't cry. I didn't editorialize. Patricia listened without interruption, her reading glasses low on her nose, making occasional notes in a leather-bound pad. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked at me directly. "Tennessee is a fault divorce state," she said. "Adultery is recognized grounds. Given the duration and the documented financial pattern, we're in a strong position. The question is, assets and timing. Has he been given any indication you're pursuing legal action?" "No," I said. "Keep it that way for now." She explained the process. the filing, the automatic temporary injunctions that would freeze joint assets at the moment of service, the importance of not moving money or making large purchases before then. She told me to open an individual bank account and begin transferring my direct deposit from the joint account, which I was entitled to do as long as I wasn't attempting to hide assets. She told me to document. I left her office feeling something I hadn't felt since before the phone call: clear. The following days moved strangely. On the surface, our household functioned. Daniel and I coexisted in a muted, careful way, two people navigating the same space with the elaborate courtesy of strangers. He was trying. I could see it. Small gestures, fresh flowers on the kitchen counter, asking if I wanted anything when he went to the store, coming home on time every single evening. He thought he was winning back ground. He didn't understand that the ground he thought he was standing on had already shifted beneath him. At my practice, I kept working. My patients needed me steady, and the routine helped. The discipline of holding space for someone else's pain is, paradoxically, a useful containment for your own. Then came the confirmation I hadn't sought, but had half expected. Karen, at my request, had quietly done what Karen does best. She is a real estate agent, social in the way that means she knows everyone and everything in Nashville's professional circles. She didn't ask for gossip. She simply mentioned Daniel's name over lunch to a colleague whose husband worked at the same company. What came back was this: Daniel's company had a policy against employees pursuing romantic relationships with subordinates. Megan, it turned out, worked in his department. She was a junior account coordinator. She'd been for 3.5 years. That single fact changed the financial landscape entirely. If Megan filed a complaint, which, given that she was now pregnant and apparently believed she'd been in a committed relationship, was not improbable, Daniel could lose his position, his income, his pension contributions. Everything Patricia and I had been calculating could shift dramatically. I didn't share this information with Daniel. Instead, I called Patricia and told her what I'd learned. She told me to let it unfold naturally and focus on our filing timeline. The proof I had been waiting for arrived on a Wednesday, 2.5 weeks after the phone call. I had given Daniel access to the family computer to print something, and he'd forgotten, or not bothered, to log out of his personal email on the shared browser. I wasn't looking for it. I opened the browser to check a patient's insurance portal, and there it was, his inbox, open, unguarded. I didn't read through it. That's not what I did. I took a single screenshot of one email, the most recent in a thread labeled with a woman's name I didn't recognize, dated 3 days after my phone call with Megan. The subject line was, "We need to be careful now." That was enough. I forwarded it to my private email, cleared the browser history so he wouldn't know I'd seen it, and closed the laptop. My hands were steady. My heart was not. I went to my car, sat in the driveway, and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to feel everything that was trying to come through. The grief, the fury, the absurdity of still loving someone who had done this, the bewildering intimacy of knowing a person so well and not having known them at all. And then I drove to Patricia's office without an appointment and asked the receptionist to fit me in. "We have what we need," I said when Patricia came out to meet me. She looked at my face and nodded. "Then we file Friday," she said. The papers were served to Daniel on a Friday afternoon at his office. Patricia had advised me on timing, serve him at work during the day when he couldn't immediately come home and escalate. Give him a few hours to absorb it in the presence of colleagues, with the natural social inhibition that environment provides. It wasn't cruelty, it was strategy. I was at Karen's house when it happened. We sat in her sunroom with cups of tea. Neither of us was really drinking, and at 2:47 p.m., my phone showed a notification from the process server confirming delivery. I put the phone face down on the table and exhaled. "Done," I said. Karen put her hand over mine. Daniel was home by 4. I heard his car in the driveway. I was back in the house by then. It was still my home. Patricia had been explicit about the importance of me remaining in the marital residence, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a book I wasn't reading. He came in and stood in the doorway to the kitchen. He was holding the envelope. His face was gray. "You filed," he said. "Yes." Without telling me, without even trying to. "Daniel," I kept my voice level, "I gave you every opportunity to tell me the truth. For 4 years, that opportunity existed." He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, the same chair he'd been sitting in the night of the phone call. The symmetry of it wasn't lost on me. What happened next, I had not anticipated. 2 days later, on a Sunday morning, a car I didn't recognize pulled into our driveway. I watched from the upstairs window as a woman got out, late 30s, expensively dressed, with the kind of posture that broadcasts confidence like a signal. Daniel's mother, Patricia. No, not Patricia. This woman was younger. She walked to the front door without hesitation and rang the bell. I went downstairs and opened the door. "Claire," she said, as though we knew each other. "I'm Renata Whitmore, Daniel's sister." I'd met Renata once at a cousin's wedding 7 years ago. She lived in Atlanta. I had no idea Daniel had contacted her. "He called me," she said before I could ask. "He's devastated, Claire. He wants to make this right. The baby, it's complicated. You have to understand his position." "I understand his position perfectly," I said, "and this isn't a conversation I'm going to have at my front door." I closed it. But Renata was not the real threat. The real threat arrived 48 hours later in the form of a voicemail from a number I didn't know. A man's voice, smooth and deliberate, identifying himself as a friend of Daniel's named Scott. He said he had information about my private practice, specifically about billing irregularities, that he thought I might want to discuss privately before it reached the wrong ears. I stood in my kitchen and listened to that message twice. Then I called Patricia. "It's intimidation," she said flatly. "They're looking for leverage. Do you have any billing issues I should know about?" "Absolutely not." "Then it's empty. But we need to respond strategically. Don't call him back. Don't engage. Let me handle it." Patricia sent a single letter through her office to the number Scott had called from, informing him that any further contact constituted potential harassment and that all communications regarding this matter should be directed to legal counsel. We heard nothing from Scott again, but I'd felt it. The brief, cold press of real fear. These people were willing to manufacture threats. They were willing to go after my livelihood. The protection I'd built, the filing, the attorney, the documentation, had provoked them into showing exactly who they were. That night, after I'd locked the house and checked the windows and lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, I did something I hadn't done since I was a child. I cried without trying to stop it, not from despair, from exhaustion, from the sheer weight of having to be this strategic, this relentless, this careful, when all I had wanted was a marriage that was what it appeared to be. I gave myself the weekend. I went to my sister's house in Knoxville. I walked by the river. I ate meals I didn't cook. I slept more than 8 hours 2 nights in a row. I let myself be held by people who loved me without agenda. By Sunday evening, I was ready. I drove back to Nashville on a Sunday with the windows down and the radio off. I needed the quiet, not the quiet of numbness, The quiet of someone who has made a decision so deeply that it no longer requires constant reaffirmation. The crying was done. The fear had been useful. It had shown me the shape of what I was up against, and in seeing it clearly, I had stopped dreading it. The house felt different when I returned, or maybe I felt different in it. I walked through the rooms with a kind of calm detachment, looking at the furniture we'd chosen together, the art we'd hung, the small accumulated objects of 11 years, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not grief, something closer to clarity. Daniel was not there. He had moved to a hotel the previous week after Patricia's office had sent a formal letter requesting he vacate the marital residence during proceedings. He'd done it without incident, which suggested his own attorney had counseled compliance. On Monday morning, he called. "I just want to talk," he said. "Not about the lawyers, just us." "There's nothing between us that isn't now a legal matter," I said. It wasn't coldness, it was precision. He tried again. This time, the approach was different, softer. He said he'd been seeing a therapist. He said he understood what he'd done. He used words like accountability and processing, and I recognized them immediately as the vocabulary of someone who had learned the language of emotional health without necessarily meaning it. I'm a therapist. That particular performance is one I have seen from the inside of too many sessions. "I'm glad you're seeing someone," I said, genuinely. "But Daniel, this isn't a conversation I'm able to have right now." What surprised me was Megan. I had expected her to disappear into the background of this story. A complicating factor, a detail to be managed. Instead, she called me again 2 weeks after the first call. This time, she was crying. "He's been lying to me too," she said. "He told me he was going to leave you. For 4 years, he told me that. And now his family is telling me I need to get a paternity test before any support discussions. They're treating me like I'm nothing." I listened. I did not share strategy with her. I did not offer alliance. But I also did not hang up. "Megan," I said when she finished, "get your own attorney, today. Not a family friend, a real family law attorney who handles paternity and support cases." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you hate me?" "I don't have the energy for it," I said, which was the truth. The real support I found in those weeks came from an unexpected source. A group of women Karen introduced me to, informally. 3 of her clients, friends of hers, all of whom had navigated divorces of various complexity. We met once for dinner, and it became a weekly thing without anyone planning it that way. There was Dana, who had rebuilt her financial life after a divorce that had nearly bankrupted her because she hadn't understood the joint debt. There was Michelle, who had lost and regained custody of her children over 2 years of litigation and come through it with the kind of steadiness that can only be built, not borrowed. And there was Susan, who was simply the funniest person I'd ever met and who could make a table of shell-shocked women laugh until they were wiping their eyes, not from grief. These women did not tell me what to do. They did not offer platitudes. They simply showed up, week after week, and their continued presence was its own form of testimony. People survive this. You will too. I cannot overstate what that meant. I am a therapist. I know intellectually that social support is a determinative factor in recovery from trauma. But knowing it and feeling it are different things. Having Dana pass me the breadbasket and say, "Patricia hasn't lost a high-asset case in 6 years. You're going to be fine." That landed in my body in a way that no amount of self-knowledge could replicate. I was not alone. And Daniel, I suspected, was beginning to understand the implications of that. It was a Thursday evening when they came. I'd just gotten home from my last patient session of the day. a long one, emotionally heavy, the kind that stays with you in the body even after the hour is over. I was standing in the kitchen, still in my coat, too tired to think about dinner, scrolling through a delivery menu with the particular vacancy of someone who has used up everything they had on other people. The doorbell rang, and I looked through the peephole and saw Renata. She was not alone, standing slightly behind her, with an expression I can only describe as carefully assembled contrition, the look of a man who has been coached on how to appear sorry without actually surrendering anything, was Daniel. I stood at the door for a moment before opening it, not from fear. It was the deliberate act of steadying myself. I took one breath. Then I opened it. I opened it because not opening it had its own problems. It would look like avoidance, and I was not afraid of either of them. What I felt was something cooler and more useful than fear, a kind of alert stillness, the same quality I bring into difficult sessions with patients, present, watchful, not reactive. "We just want to talk," Renata said. Her tone was different from the first visit. The sharp efficiency was gone, replaced by something softer, more deliberate. She was wearing gentleness like a costume selected for the occasion, and she wore it well. If I hadn't already seen the other version of her, I might have been persuaded. 5 minutes, I said. I did not invite them in. We stood on the porch. I kept the screen door between us, not locked, just present. A small boundary that no one acknowledged and everyone understood. What followed was a performance I might have admired for its craft if it hadn't been directed at me. Renata spoke first. She talked about family, about how the Whitmore family had always handled difficulties privately, quietly. She talked about mistakes that good people make, framing Daniel's 4 years of sustained deception as a lapse, a failure of judgment, something that had happened rather than something he had chosen repeatedly, every single day. She talked about the damage prolonged litigation causes for everyone, the financial cost, the emotional cost, and then, with the careful pivot of someone who has rehearsed the transition, she talked about how it would be so much better for me too, for me, she emphasized, to resolve this quietly rather than dragging everything through discovery and depositions. I noticed she never once used the word wrong. She talked about the affair the way people talk about bad weather, as if cause and consequence were beside the point, as if only the aftermath needed managing. Then Daniel spoke. He was emotional in a way that looked real. And perhaps it was, partly. His voice broke slightly at the edges. His eyes were red from what appeared to be genuine sleeplessness. He said he knew he had destroyed something irreplaceable. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He said therapy had been difficult and necessary. He said he wasn't the man he wanted to be, but he was trying to become him. It was a more sophisticated appeal than I had expected. He had done the reading. He knew the vocabulary. But then came the pivot. A protracted legal battle would hurt us both, and he was willing to offer a private settlement, a fair one. His attorney had signed off on it. He slid a folded piece of paper toward me across the porch railing with the deliberate gentleness of someone offering a gift. I looked at it. I did not pick it up. "What is this?" I asked. "A settlement proposal," Renata said, stepping back in with practiced efficiency. "No court involvement. You keep the house. A clean split of the accounts. Daniel retains his pension in full. It's fair, Claire. Genuinely more than fair." Was it? There was a part of me that felt the pull of it. The exhausted part, the part that had been carrying months of strategy and vigilance, that looked at the folded paper and thought, take it, end it, go live your life. I understood in that moment why people accept bad settlements. The war costs things that don't appear in any financial calculation. But I knew what Patricia had told me clearly and more than once. Daniel's pension, accrued across 16 years, including the 4 during which he'd been systematically using marital funds on Megan, was subject to equitable distribution claims that went well beyond a clean split. The proposal was designed to look generous while protecting his single most valuable long-term asset. He wasn't offering me fairness. He was offering me the appearance of it, dressed in the language of reconciliation. "I have an attorney," I said. "All proposals go through her." "Claire," he started, his voice edging toward something more urgent. "I'm not angry," I said, and I meant it. "I'm just not interested in informal negotiations, not after the voicemail." Renata's face changed, just slightly. A tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible recalibration of the kind you learn to read when you spend years doing what I do. "That wasn't supposed to happen," she said. I let the words sit for a moment, because what they meant was clear. She knew. She had known about Scott's call, about the threat made against my practice, and her chosen phrase wasn't "I didn't know" or "I'm sorry." It was, "It wasn't supposed to happen," as if the problem were the execution rather than the intent. "Good night," I said. I closed the door, firmly, quietly. I stood in the hallway listening, their voices on the porch, low and tense, then footsteps, the gate. Renata's car pulling away with more speed than the street called for. I went to the kitchen and sat down. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the physical residue of having held a position under sustained, skilled pressure without giving ground, of having been presented with something genuinely tempting and choosing clearly not to take it. And underneath the trembling, something else moved through me, solid and quiet. They came here because they are afraid of what discovery will find. That thought settled into me like a foundation stone dropping into place. I made myself a cup of tea, went to bed earlier than I had in months, and slept without interruption until morning. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday in late May. Patricia had prepared me extensively. We had met 4 times in the 2 weeks leading up to it, working through every question Daniel's attorney might ask, every document they might introduce, every attempt to rattle me or reframe the narrative. "You will be calm," Patricia said, not as instruction but as observation. "You already are. That's your advantage." Daniel's attorney was a man named Greg Ferris, pleasant-faced, methodical, the kind of lawyer who relies on endurance rather than brilliance. He would try to establish that our marriage had been troubled before the affair. He would try to suggest that Daniel's emotional needs had been unmet, that I had been distant, preoccupied with work. It was a strategy as old as infidelity itself. If the marriage was already broken, the affair becomes less an act of betrayal and more an act of self-preservation. What Greg Ferris did not know, yet, was what Patricia had spent 8 weeks quietly assembling. The financial forensics had taken most of that time. We'd hired a CPA who specialized in marital asset analysis, and what she found in Daniel's records was thorough and damning. Over 4 years, he had spent approximately $47,000 of marital funds on Megan. Hotels, travel, gifts, meals. This was documented across credit card statements, bank transfers, and 2 personal loans from his retirement account he'd taken without my knowledge. Under Tennessee law, this constituted dissipation of marital assets. The implications for the division were significant. There was more. Megan, through her own attorney, had quietly agreed to provide a written statement confirming the duration of the affair and the representations Daniel had made to her. specifically that he and I were separated. This statement was not something I had arranged. It was something Patricia had requested through proper channels, and Megan had agreed to it, I think, because she was angry. Whatever Daniel had done to her in the weeks after my filing, the paternity demands, the withdrawal, the sudden coldness after 4 years of promises, had burned away any remaining loyalty she might have felt toward him. The deposition room was small and fluorescent. Daniel arrived with Greg Ferris and sat across the table from me, flanked by his attorney. He looked thinner. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping well for months. There were shadows under his eyes I didn't recognize, and his suit, always immaculate, always his armor, looked slightly wrong on him, as if he'd lost weight since the last fitting. He didn't look at me when he first sat down. He arranged his papers and whispered something to Greg and kept his eyes carefully away from mine for a full 2 minutes. I watched him do it. I waited. Renata was not there. She had no legal standing. Greg Ferris began methodically. He asked about our communication patterns, my work schedule, the periods I'd traveled for continuing education. He asked leading questions with careful innocence. Would you say you and Daniel shared your emotional lives openly? Did you often work evenings? Were there periods when you felt disconnected from each other? I answered each one without elaboration, exactly as Patricia had taught me. Short, factual, giving nothing extra. Yes. No. I don't recall. Could you clarify the question? Greg was building a portrait of a marriage already half dead before Megan entered it. I could see the brushstrokes. I let him paint. And then Patricia began. She entered the financial records, all of them. She presented the CPA's analysis, line by line, amount by amount. The hotel in Atlanta, the necklace from a jewelry store in Brentwood, the weekend in New Orleans that Daniel had told me was a sales conference. She presented Megan's statement. She presented the email I had screenshotted from his open inbox. We need to be careful now. And the cell tower data from Daniel's carrier that placed his phone in a neighborhood 20 minutes from our house. Overnight, on 6 separate occasions, he'd claimed to be in other cities. She was methodical and unhurried. She did not perform. She simply laid the evidence on the table piece by piece, the way you lay bricks, not for drama, but for structure. I watched Daniel's face through all of it. It was the face of a man whose story was being taken apart, piece by piece, in front of witnesses, under oath, with no version of it left intact. The smooth composure that had sustained him through 11 years of living 2 lives began to fail in small, visible ways. A slight reddening at the jaw, a hand that moved to his water glass and stayed there too long, a pause before answering a simple question that lasted a beat too long. Greg Ferris objected when he could. He shuffled papers. He asked for breaks. At one point, he leaned close to Daniel and whispered something I couldn't hear, and Daniel shook his head with the small, defeated motion of someone who has finally run out of road. There was nowhere left to redirect, no version of events that the documents didn't contradict. The man who had spent 4 years being seamlessly convincing sat across from me and could no longer hold the seams together. Renata had texted me twice during the deposition. I saw it afterward on my silence phone. This is not who we are as a family. And then, 20 minutes later, you're going to regret this. I saved both messages and forwarded them to Patricia. Good, she said simply, reading them in the corridor afterward. Daniel said one thing to me in the lobby as we were leaving. Not to threaten, I think, but because he genuinely couldn't help himself. He said, "I never stopped loving you." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the kitchen light on the night of the phone call, The tennis ball in the yard, the 11 years of mornings that had all contained this secret at their center, moving through them the way a splinter moves through tissue, invisibly, painfully, always deeper. "I know," I said. "That's the part that doesn't matter anymore." And I walked out into the May afternoon where the air was warm and the trees were green, and Nashville was going about its business as if none of this had happened. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, face lifted slightly toward the sun, and I breathed. The settlement came 6 weeks after the deposition. Patricia called me on a Friday morning and said, "They've come back with an offer." Her tone told me everything before she said the numbers. It was not the sanitized proposal Daniel had pushed across my porch railing on that Thursday evening when he and Renata had arrived with their rehearsed contrition and their folded piece of paper. It was not the version designed to look generous while protecting what mattered most to him. This was a reckoning, built from 8 weeks of careful, documented, forensically supported work, and from the simple fact that Greg Ferris had advised his client that going to trial with that evidence on the table would be worse than surrendering to it. I kept the house, its full equity valued at $483,000. I received 60% of the joint savings and investment accounts, the higher percentage justified by the documented dissipation of marital assets. Daniel's pension, accrued during the marriage, was divided by QDRO. I received the portion corresponding to the marital years, which represented a significant future income stream. He retained his stock options, but their current value was modest. The company's stock had dropped considerably after an internal HR investigation was opened regarding his relationship with Megan, which had violated the company's fraternization policy. He was placed on administrative leave pending review. He did not contest the settlement. I think by that point he was tired in the same bone-level way I had been tired, except that his exhaustion came from the collapse of a deception and mine had come from surviving one. Those are very different kinds of tired. His attorney filed the final paperwork on a Wednesday in July. By that point, Megan had given birth to a daughter, a fact I learned not from Daniel, but from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it without fanfare, the way people mention things they assume you already know. I sat with that information for a long moment when I heard it. A child existed now, a real small person who'd been brought into the world out of all of this, who would grow up navigating whatever version of her father she was given. I felt something complicated about that. Not animosity, but a heaviness I couldn't entirely name. Some situations don't resolve into clean feelings. That one didn't. Daniel would be responsible for child support, determined by a separate paternity proceeding Megan had initiated with her own attorney. On the day the divorce was finalized, I was not in a courtroom. In Tennessee, uncontested divorces can be finalized without the parties present. Patricia called me as I was walking Biscuit along the greenway near my house. My greenway, my house, words that still carried a slight charge every time I used them. "It's done," she said. I stopped walking. Biscuit looked up at me, puzzled by the pause. The greenway stretched ahead of us in both directions, dappled and quiet. A woman jogged past with earbuds in. A kid on a bicycle rang his bell at a squirrel. Life, moving at its ordinary pace around this extraordinary moment. "Thank you," I said. "You did the work," Patricia said. "I just organized it." That evening, Karen and the women from our dinner group came over. Nobody planned a celebration. That word felt wrong for what this was. It wasn't a victory party. It was more like the quiet acknowledgement that something enormous had been survived, and that survival deserved to be witnessed by people who loved you. Susan brought a very good bottle of wine, and Dana brought a cheese board, and Michelle brought flowers from her garden, great armfuls of them. And we sat on my back porch until it was dark and talked about everything and nothing. The conversation wandered. Recipes, Karen's difficult client, Susan's promotion, a book Michelle had read, and the ease of it, the sheer ordinary ease of sitting with people who required nothing from you but your presence, undid me slightly. I didn't cry. I just felt it. Renata sent one final message, not to me directly, but through Daniel's family attorney, a formal note expressing hope that the matter was now closed. Patricia responded in kind, professionally and briefly. That was the last communication. Renata's presence, which had loomed large in my mind for months as a symbol of the forces arrayed against me, simply receded. She was just a woman in Atlanta who had involved herself in something that wasn't her story. What I want to tell you, what matters in the full accounting of all of it, is what happened to the things Daniel had tried so hard to protect. The company investigation found sufficient evidence of the fraternization policy violation and the use of company resources on personal matters. Travel reimbursements claimed for trips that had nothing to do with work, expenses routed through accounts that shouldn't have carried them. Daniel was terminated in August. His severance package was modest, less than he'd expected, shaped by the circumstances of his departure. He moved out of the hotel and into a rental apartment in a suburb he'd never shown any interest in. The severance ran out faster than he planned. The child support obligation began. I heard through Karen's network, because Nashville is smaller than it seems, that he had returned to sales work, but at a lower level for a different company, driving a longer commute to a territory outside the city that offered none of the seniority he'd spent 16 years building. I did not feel satisfaction at his losses. I want to be honest about that, because the cleaner narrative would be to say I did. What I felt was more neutral, the way you feel when a storm finally passes and you can assess the damage to the yard. Not glad it rained, simply glad the roof held. A year after the divorce was finalized, I repainted the kitchen. It's such a small thing. But I had wanted to repaint that kitchen for 4 years, and Daniel had always had a reason to put it off. The timing, the disruption, the particular shade of sage green I'd chosen that he said would look dated in 5 years. I hired a painter the first week of September and stood in my kitchen the following Monday morning, drinking coffee in a room that was mine in a way it had never quite been before, and I thought, this is what it feels like. Not triumph, just ease. I had kept the house, but I'd also kept my practice, which, if anything, had grown. When you go through something as consuming as what I went through, and you emerge from it still able to be present for your patients, something shifts in how you practice. I understood certain things more personally than I ever had. I had more patience for the slow work of rebuilding. Several patients told me, in ways they couldn't quite articulate, that I seemed different in the best possible way, more solid somehow. I started running again, something I'd let lapse years ago. I found a running group that met on Saturday mornings near the park, and I began showing up, first tentatively, and then with something approaching genuine enjoyment. That's where I met Harriet, a cardiologist with a dry sense of humor and a rescue greyhound named Fletcher, who became my closest running partner, and over the following months, one of my most important friendships. The dinner group continued. We added 2 new members, both referred by Karen, both in various stages of navigating major life transitions. Dana went back to school for her financial planning license. Michelle's daughter started college. Susan got a promotion and moved into a larger apartment and hosted us there in style. I traveled. Rome in March, a road trip along the coast of Oregon in June. Small things and large things, chosen entirely by me, accountable to no one else's preferences. As for Daniel, I heard things. The way you hear things in a city where everyone knows everyone eventually. His new job didn't last. There was a second job, and then a gap, and then a third. The child support obligation created a financial pressure he apparently hadn't anticipated. Megan, I learned through an unexpected channel. She'd called me once more, about a year in, not for drama, but to say something simple, almost formal. I'm sorry for my part in it. I know you didn't owe me anything. I told her I appreciated that. We did not become friends. We had no reason to. But the call closed something. Renata, I heard, had her own difficulties, a professional situation in Atlanta that I knew nothing about and didn't seek to know. She had sent no further communications. What had I lost? 11 years invested in a partnership that was not what I believed it to be. Time, a version of the future I had planned for. The particular grief of loving someone genuinely and discovering that the love was not housed in the person you thought it was. What had I kept? Everything that was actually mine. My practice, my name, my clarity, my credit score perfect. Because every joint account I'd opened had been paid on time, and the new individual accounts I'd built were spotless. My friendships, deepened by the crisis, my capacity for joy, which I had genuinely feared might be a casualty and was not. Biscuit slept at the foot of my bed, which he had always done, indifferent to human drama. On my 39th birthday, Karen threw a small dinner party. At the end of the night, when the other guests had gone and we were washing dishes, she asked me, "Are you happy?" I thought about the word. I'm a therapist. I know its complications. The way happiness is not a destination but a weather pattern, variable and unpredictable. Yes, I said. And then, because it was Karen, actually, genuinely yes. She clinked her glass against mine. Outside, Nashville was lit up and loud and ongoing, the way cities always are, indifferent to individual stories. But inside that kitchen, my kitchen, sage green and luminous, I was exactly where I needed to be.